Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, social media has been playing an increasing role in how we receive and interpret our news. Politicians have begun to use it more to get their message out to the public, with both positive and negative consequences. But as our guest today has said, it has also reached the point where politics is so polarized, it has rendered reason, judgment, and compromise obsolete. Is social media becoming a liability to the nation? Next. Joining me today is Diana Owen, professor of political science in the Communication, Culture, and Technology graduate program of Georgetown University. Dr. Owen is the author of several books, and her latest book is American Government and Politics in the Information Age. She is the recipient of the Daniel Roselle Award of the Middle States Council on Social Studies. Dr. Owen, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start off with this. In your article, The Past Decade and Future of Political Media, you state that, political encounters have become more coarsened. But you also state something that political polarization has rendered reason judgment obsolete. Could you say more about that?
Yes. I think what's happened with political media is that it's been used as a weapon by both sides. The intense polarization of left and right, Republican, Democrat, has increased the heated rhetoric that's occurred between the parties and between individuals. And we have so many ways now of disseminating that kind of vicious information in some ways, that it's creating a situation where, kind of, I think there's no way back. I don't see a way that we're able to put that kind of, those kinds of exchanges back into the bottle.
So, how do we get to this point? I mean, obviously, you did talk about the fact that former President Obama was really one of the first people, at least in this generation, to use social media in the way that he did. And obviously, former President Trump took it to another level. But how do we get to the point where a person's tweet becomes it becomes the subject of a whole news program? I mean, how do we get to that point?
Well, there's many different factors that have gone into, us arriving at this point in media history. Some of it has to go back to kind of the decline of traditional media or legacy media. There's fewer and fewer resources for journalists to gather information. So a lot of the time, journalists are looking through social media to try and find, some tidbit of information that they can turn into a story. With fewer resources for reporting and fewer resources, especially for investigative research and investigative reporting, journalists are relying increasingly on, just finding some tidbit of information that they can churn, that will gain headlines, that will gain eyeballs. And so it doesn't require a lot of, kind of knowledge or a lot of research to be able to find a tweet that's inflammatory and to use it over and over and over again. And that then starts to substitute for real news. And that's what I find to be kind of one of the most troubling trends, is that we no longer have much in the way of true journalism. What we have now is journalists looking at social media, trying to find something that they think is going to generate audience shares, and then churning it without much context, without much depth, just getting an inflammatory comment out there.
So that would raise the question then, is the issue social media, because that's a vehicle and people have used that as a vehicle and they've used it as part of an overall strategy. But then is the problem real the intended audience, which is you and I and other people who engage with social media? Is that the problem? That is not really the vehicle, it's the audience.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, between 70 and 80% of us now get news and information from social media. And it's starting to displace, sources of hard news, and it has long ago displaced sources of, legacy news media, where we might get some quality information that's fact checked and validated. I'm not so sure you can blame the audience. I guess if we are willing to buy into this, that we're still willing to, kind of constantly tune in. Sometimes I find myself that it's hard to look away. I'll get some sort of clickbait or something, and I'll just, stick with it because I'm wanting to find out what's behind that. Oh, wow, that's really sensational. What's the source of that? And, I get to it. There's not much information there, but it's a quick hit, and I'm done with it. And I think a lot of the problem for the audience is the fact that we're starting to become socialized to kind of expecting and relying on really short hits of news. Used to be that people would read an in-depth story, they want to find out the facts, and there was plenty of that content out there for us. But now everything is kind of rapid fire and repetition and short tidbits. I'd say even shorter than your typical soundbite. There used to be this big concern that of the shrinking soundbite in the traditional news era. Well, now we get something that's much shorter than sound bites, much more repetitious than sound bites, and yet we keep buying into it. But when your news diet consists of, that's the smorgasbord, that's what you're being offered. I think that the audience doesn't have as much choice. It seems like we have a lot of choice, but in reality, we're just getting the same tidbits of information from a lot of different places.
Follow up on that, and I want to ask a question that veers off that a little bit. But you've been following this for a long, long time, and as we know, part of human nature is that we do tend to be drawn to things that confirms where we have an emotional investment. And so, when I look at the Trump crowds or Obama crowds, whatever the case may be, it's where we have an emotional investment. And in many cases, it's truth be damned, and on either side. So, is there a way to create a mediating institution where the news media has failed? What can that mediating institution look like that can begin to engage people in what is reality?
That's a really tough, that's a tough agenda. That's a tough assignment. It's something I've been thinking about because there's a lot of research that's been done on, how people are pretty siloed in their, kind of in the messages that they receive and the messages that they are receptive to. And the fact that misinformation, if it fits with your, predetermined agenda and your mindset, you're going to kind of believe it. On the one hand, research shows that, once information gets into your mind, there's nothing that's going to dislodge it. People forget exactly where they learned it from. And so that bit of information kind of remains there. However, there's also some research that shows that if we counter misinformation quickly and keep correcting it, that eventually it will have the effect of changing people's minds. But I think that research or the findings of that research indicate that people have to have an open mind to begin with. And so changing people's views about misinformation it's going to be very difficult, particularly getting back to your early question about polarization, since so many people have staked out strong positions on, either side of the political spectrum. It's going to be very hard to set up an institution that's going to be able to mediate that and to, kind of deal with misinformation. I think there's a lot of, valiant efforts out there that have been aimed at trying to, kind of deal with misinformation. But I really myself have some difficulty thinking that they're going to be especially successful. I know the Knight Foundation and other places have started to investigate ways of, kind of mitigating misinformation through correcting and, kind of other ways of dealing with it. But I'm not so sure that given the political situation that we have right now and the way that people's minds are really set, that it's going to be that effective. So have done some work on social media, working with colleagues in Asia. And there was a colleague who was in Hong Kong who said that they have an actual news program every day that deals with misinformation. So it takes some misinformation, so that's been widespread, and then in the format of a formal news program, goes and debunks that. It's very popular there. It seems to be effective there, but it's a completely different political culture than we have here.
Let me ask you this then. Is one of the issues guardrails? And when we talk about some of these issues in terms of the truth or a lie, we're all familiar with the axiom that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth puts on its pants. But is it also the guardrails? I mean, if you take, for example, the last election, where the notion of the election being stolen and all of that, election deniers. Well, the Speaker of the House right now is a key election denier. And in former days, the Speaker would have been a guardrail. Even in the days of Richard Nixon, you had politicians on the Republican side who were guardrails. People like Barry Goldwater and people like that, even though my politics would not in any way agree with Goldwater, but he was a guardrail. And he went up to President Nixon and said, "It's done. You need to go." And it seems like we don't have those guardrails anymore. So how can social media become a guardrail, or who would be the guardrails for social media?
I'm not so sure that it's possible to institute guardrails on social media. I mean, it's a constantly changing media environment. There's no real boundaries to it, and so I think it's really difficult to kind of set those guardrails there. And I think what have become the new norms of social media, it's just anything goes, and pushing the boundaries as opposed to kind of reining, kind of the rhetoric in seems to be kind of the primary norm of what goes on social media. I mean, getting back to your earlier question, in order to be able to, attract the attention of journalists and get your message out there, you have to become more and more extreme. That seems to be the, kind of the primary rule of thumb today. And so the more extreme you become, the farther out the guardrails go. And I think the example that you gave of the new Speaker of the House being an election denier, and so many people who don't even believe that necessarily go along with it because of political expediency. I think as long as we have that as our political norms, I don't think we'll be able to rein in social media. And I know there's some efforts now on the part of, people who, kind of control social media or the social media organizations to say that they're going to limit speech on social media during election campaigns to try and, kind of curb the amount of misinformation that's going there. My, kind of what I say to that is good luck, because social media is not like a traditional media organization that did have guardrails, that had rules, that had editors that, would look at the information, parse it, research it, make sure that the sources were all there before something could actually be published. And now even those organizations, I feel, are pressured to, go beyond those guardrails because they need to be able to survive in this environment. And the way that you do is by putting content out there that's going to grab eyeballs.
Is one of the problems also when you say that we can't really put guardrails on, but there are efforts, let's say in the United States, for example, the U.S. Senate and the House has called in social media executives to begin talking about this process. So an organization like Facebook or now Twitter or Truth Social, whatever it is, they do have a capability for ferreting out which is an out and out lie. And but isn't it true that people like Mark Zuckerberg and perhaps Elon Musk are not going to do this, even though they call on the government to say you need to do something, but it's already in their control in terms of what they can do. So if you can't create guardrails for the social media in of itself, can you create guardrails for the ones who actually run it, like a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk or other people like that?
Well, I think it might be possible, but I don't think it's probable because of the history of what we've seen. When Mark Zuckerberg or some other, kind of big media personnel go to Capitol Hill and testify, they basically say, oh yeah, we're going to take these steps. They try to reassure government officials and the public that they can do it on their own. And since it's such a difficult task to, kind of basically regulate social media or media in general, but social media in particular, I think it's something that the government has a hard time getting a handle on. So they go up there, they make an appeal, they admit that there's problems, and then they say that we'll solve them ourselves. And this has been a history, of media doing this, taking this strategy, going way, way back to the beginning of radio, film, even newspapers saying, we'll take it on ourselves, we'll regulate ourselves. And, because they'll do that because they don't want the government to step in. But when they go back to their offices, they're probably just, kind of laughing and saying, oh, we got away with it again, because nothing much happens. And, Facebook, for example, has employed people to try and ferret out misinformation, to try and find, and Twitter before Elon Musk had people that would, kind of review the content, find people who were abusers and, in some cases, revoke their privileges, such as happened to Donald Trump and some others. But really, that's a very small amount of content that they're actually regulating. And more recently, there's been a cutting back on personnel and resources that have been devoted by social media companies to these kinds of efforts. So I think that it's something that's really, it's difficult to do to begin with. I think with social media, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. You fix one thing and the problem comes up elsewhere. The other thing that we have to deal with social media and regulating social media is concerns about, First Amendment free speech. Americans are very, very, very protective of free speech. And, political leaders do not want to trample on free speech. And so that argument always kind of gets into the mix. And I think rightly so. But the question becomes, at what point does free speech and that boundary, what point does it become dangerous to our democracy if we allow free speech to go untethered, like election denialism? That undermines our system of democracy in a really major way. Yet, people would also argue, due to our First Amendment freedom, which we prize so much, we shouldn't really, curtail that kind of speech.
You talk about the media using, let's say, for example, tweets to inform their news coverage. But you also talk about the increase of news deserts. And could you say some more about that? What do you mean by that? And what role do they play, or the lack of them? What role does that play in the preponderance of social media?
Yeah, I think media deserts is one of the biggest problems that we have right now facing our media system. And people generally tend to trust and rely on their local media. It's community-based, it has relevance to them, and they tend to, trust it more than national media. But increasingly, local community newspapers have been shutting down, or sometimes where there have been competitive newspapers, one of them has shut down. In some places, there's no local newspapers anymore. Increasingly, local television news has either, kind of gone by the wayside or has been covered now by a conglomerate. And so you get more and more of the same news in local areas that has more of a national focus than actual local news. So in these places where people no longer feel that they have access to real community news, or that it's been co-opted by some sort of a large media organizations, they don't trust it as much. These are news deserts, places where we no longer have what we consider a vital community news organizations. And what happens is people are looking for alternatives. And what's been filling in is social media, because social media have some of the same, qualities of community news. If you have a network of, kind of friends on Facebook, they're people that you trust, people that you probably know at some level or have some degree of, connection to. And because of that, you're more willing to take in the information that's spread in those networks. And so I believe that the presence of news deserts has really contributed to the fact that 70 to 80% of us get a lot of our news from social media. Social media is taking over and filling in where news deserts have left people without the kind of information that they trust, feel comfortable with, or feel like they're being informed about. If you take away community orientation, you're going to get things that people don't care about, particularly with these big, kind of television news conglomerates that are, kind of filling in for local TV news. People are losing a connection, and they feel like they're getting that through social media.
Now, going back, I mean, if we go back, let's say to the 60s, is part of the problem with social media and how people gravitate towards that, particularly with things that are not true or sketchy or what have you, goes back really to the nation becoming skeptical about its own governing system. So, for example, you still have a lot of people today. Well, no, not a lot, but there are people today who will still tell you that John F. Kennedy is still alive. And when the report came out about what happened there, the majority of the country, quite frankly, does not believe it. And I'm not saying they should or not, but they don't. And so does has that created kind of number one, a skepticism about anything that is quote unquote institutional, whether it's institutional media, the government, and so it allows these other elements to come into play that we think are not bound by these traditional things that have kept us from the truth. Is that part of the problem?
Yes, I believe that that is absolutely part of the problem. I think since the 60s, 70s, Vietnam War, the, kind of civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and all that we've been through since then, there has been a decline in trust in our institutions. Although I would say that right now, at this very moment, there's probably less trust in our institutions than ever at any other time in our history. And the media are probably at the bottom of that pile. The trust in Congress, there's always been this kind of dual sense of people trusting their member of Congress, but not liking the institution. That's still true, but they really dislike the institution. There's the same kind of split situation with the presidency, but people really, at this point, really don't like the presidency. And there's now this concern that our electoral process in and of itself is not trustworthy, which I think is something that's kind of a newer development, because faith in democracy and faith in our electoral system was something that people really have felt strongly about for a long time, until recently, until it's been constantly called into question. But with the lack of media trust, I think it does open the door to these to alternative sources. And I think that was really the point, even going back about, a quarter century, that which is as long as we've had new media now. We've had these kind of alternative sources. People started to see that there was a way that they could get their own voice heard. They could hear the voices of their neighbors. They could hear people that they felt that they could trust. And over time, it's kind of developed into the situation that we have now. And I myself and my lab with some grad students, we've been doing a series of studies looking at how much people trust different types of media. And they don't necessarily trust social media all that much, but they sure do trust it more than, kind of mainstream, especially cable TV or, some other sources. Local news, though, still, is a notch above the rest, but none of it's really well trusted. And I do think there's a long, legacy, as you say, of distrust in media. And I think there's just been many events that have come to kind of contributed to that fact. I think one thing too that kind of goes along with what you were saying about JFK, people not thinking that that he's dead. The proliferation of conspiracy theories that people believe now, I think, is unprecedented. We've always had that. There's always been, kind of belief in conspiracies, but I think that there's, just been this intensification of this kind of conspiratorial ideation where people really, truly, their mindset is, I distrust everything I'm being told by mainstream media or, other sources. And these different conspiracies, for example, that JFK Jr. is alive and well and is going to be, Donald Trump's running mate. Going along the JFK, he has a long long legacy of these kinds of conspiracies. But the whole QAnon, it's a mindset, it's an ideation that people truly, deeply believe in. And my own research and that of others has really shown that it's not really minimal. I mean, it's not restricted to a small portion of the population. There's probably 30 to 35% of the population that really believes strongly in some forms of conspiracy theory, and some of them that's forms a big part of their ideology.
You are raising the alarm on this. And I mean, let's be real. All of us have, the crazy uncle in the attic who's always had these theories about whatever. And as you're saying, but it is exploded. And there is a preponderance now, and it gets exploded by these new vehicles, social media. So my question to you is then, what needs to happen, as you are sounding the alarm, what needs to happen in order to stem the tide of this? And what will happen, in your opinion? What would you project where we will be with this if we don't do something to rein it in, or to create guardrails, or to do something that can compete with this proliferation of social media? And I want to preface that with one of the things that has come out also is the notion of artificial intelligence. And there was a recent ad put out by Ron DeSantis of Donald Trump embracing Dr. Fauci. The problem was it was not accurate. It was something that was composed through artificial intelligence. And that seems to be another direction in which this is going to go. So, what do we have to do to stem this?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of your question. This is something that I think about a lot, particularly since I have to say it was my graduate students that got me interested in this notion of conspiracy theories, because they were hearing relatives and friends talk about, things like JFK being Donald Trump's running mate, and believing and being strongly, kind of attracted to that. And so we started doing some research on it, looking to see how widespread it was. And I was absolutely shocked at how much of the country really does believe in these QAnon types conspiracies. But there's conspiracies on left and right, and all across the political spectrum. And so, and when people really start to kind of dig into these conspiracies and go deeper and deeper, I think it's very difficult to dislodge them from that. And it goes along with the idea of people getting their media information from silos. And it seems as if people who are really tuned into these conspiracy theories are definitely getting their information mostly from some form of social media, a lot of it from, kind of the dark part of social media and the dark part of the web. And they go in there, and I think it's very difficult for them to find their way out. And, the more that I've contemplated it, the more and kind of tried to research it, I don't see, much in the way of, an antidote to it. And I give the example of, people who were part of the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. These are people that truly believe that the election was stolen. And along with that, from a whole variety of conspiracy theories that completely feed into it and reinforce that. And, there's various, kind of things like the Great Awakening and other QAnon type theories that, and they keep on developing. They get more and more and more detailed. And the more detailed they are, the more people are likely to believe them because they feel as if they have more facts about them. And getting people to, kind of come around on that is really difficult. And you see, even when some of the people who are, attacking the Capitol, when they're going off to be sentenced, they'll even say that they still believed that the election was truly stolen. And, as much as they've been told that that isn't the case, and as much as the evidence comes out that it's not the case, I think that one way that it can be, kind of countered and that guardrails can be put up is, and this is happening, that, the facts just need to be reiterated and put out in as many channels as possible, and to reach as broadly as possible. I'm not sure how easy it is to infiltrate. I think it's very difficult to infiltrate some of these places that are in the deeper, darker parts of the web. But in mainstream social media, I think that, and there are organizations, individuals, news groups that are really trying to get the truth out there and to counter that. I'm hoping that, oftentimes there is kind of a boomerang effect. When things get so bad, they seem to come back kind of more towards the center. I think we're starting to see some of that with, frankly, the various charges that have been, brought against the former president of the United States, holding him accountable. A lot of what he's being held accountable for is the misinformation that he put out there that caused people to behave in the way that they did, and, to cause the insurrection at the Capitol. So I think that we might be seeing that there is, kind of a trend towards, some guardrails that are being put there, in this case, by the judicial system, but then the actions of the judicial system are elevated by news media and on social media, and ultimately, hopefully, a critical mass will form and kind of move things kind of naturally back. In terms of any kind of institution that could be set up specifically to deal with that, I'm not sure that that could be the case, not within the media, but I think some of these actions that are happening now could be helpful. You mentioned the issue of AI. We've had situations like the DeSantis example that you talked about before with deepfakes. But deepfakes take a little bit of skill to create them and get them out there. With AI, it just becomes something that's pretty automatic. And I personally feel that that's going to be one of the biggest threats in, the 2024 election campaign, is that I'll just say in the classroom, I know that the first time I encountered, students' papers that were written by ChatGPT, I kind of could tell because they were kind of rudimentary. They all had the same, they started out with the fun fact, and then they all had 3 sentences in the paragraphs. And one of them actually quoted me without quoting me, whatever, plagiarized me, person turned it in. So you could kind of, I'm pretty good at this by now. I've been at it a long time. I thought, did they have the same person write these all for them? But then the next day, there was an APP put out at the university that people were using this ChatGPT. So, but now it's better. It was hard to fool me with that, but now ChatGPT, now AI is just in a very, very short time. It's become so much better that it's very difficult to, discern what's real from something that's created by AI. So I think the threat for the, 2024 election is going to be that. And, where we can tell, in social media, people can go and identify what's a real fact and, kind of trace misinformation and whatever. Things that are created by AI, they come from, kind of bodies of information that are out there, just manipulated in a different way. It's going to be very difficult to manage that.
One other question I would have in the few minutes we have left. So, how does a person then begin to protect themselves against false information, false news, etc., fake news, etc.? How does a person begin to do that Um, because even right now, the headlines that we see on all the news right now is obviously the Israeli military campaign against Hamas. And so even there, we're not sure about what is the real information. Is are 10,000 deaths? Is that the real number? Are we really trying to avoid killing innocents? And so we really don't know. So how does a person protect themselves against fake news, or at least to do it the best to their ability?
So I think people can protect themselves from fake news and misinformation by using the really good trusted sources that are out there. We still do have some really good, reliable news sources. And probably like your podcast, people can go there, become informed, and kind of learn what's, kind of what's real. But New York Times, the Washington Post, your major news organizations, your legacy news organizations, I've been noticing that they've even been producing more long form features that have a lot more information. And they wouldn't be producing them if people weren't reading them, which they are. And we're starting to see an increase even in certain news magazines with more research oriented investigative pieces, kind of again, the boomerang swinging back. So I would say one way that people can protect themselves is by going to trusted sources, which we do have. And most of them are legacy media sources that are still doing good news reporting, that still have the same kind of guardrails that you're talking about with editing and sourcing and norms of journalism that kind of we should respect. I'm a great believer in civic education. And I feel that one of the antidotes to all of this is strong civic education that's accompanied by strong digital media literacy or media literacy in general, where young people are learning, even elementary school students are learning how can they, kind of judge a news story? How can they judge, break something down, look at the different components of it, analyze it, critically evaluate it, and come to understand what might be some of the, kind of little signals that there's, kind of misinformation and you need to dig deeper, you need to, go to a better source. I think if we had strong civic education for all, that included digital media literacy components, that eventually some of the patterns that we see with the problems in social media might be mitigated.
Even though you've raised the sound alarm, you sounded the alarm on this, but you do have some optimism. You talked about how, as you just said, newspapers they're doing more investigative reporting. You've also talked about social media as being a good tool for various movements like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and things of that nature. So, in the last minute, it's not that you feel that it's all bad. You do have optimism about its positive use as well.
I absolutely do. I think the tools themselves can be used in a very positive way. And going back to the 2008 presidential election, when the Obama campaign was using social media for the first time, really as a tool to get people out to vote, it was used responsibly by the campaign. And it targeted people who often, don't get to the polls, young people, giving messages to them that they could understand. I think when it's used in a responsible way by candidates to get their message out, it can be really a powerful tool and a positive tool. And I also think that we're probably at a point right now, maybe a breaking point, where things might be starting to head back in another direction, and that we might have, kind of a more positive way of using social media. And again, I see that there's kind of now some calls for greater civic education. And the more of that we get behind, I think for the future, I think we have a positive outlook.
My guest today has been Diana Owen, professor of political science in the Communication, Culture, and Technology graduate program of Georgetown University. Dr. Owen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.